There we go. So great to see everyone. I hope you are thawing out if you were in one of the colder regions of the American South. I know we are warming up here in Kentucky, but we thank you so much for joining what is the latest live recording of one of our webcasts. So more importantly, we want to thank you for all that you do to move to forward opportunity and progress in the American South. So I know we're behind, but I want to give you a quick update here. Um, in 2022, you've heard this a lot. Our membership developed about $200 billion worth of capital investment that will create about 150,000 new jobs when fully realized. Those were amazing numbers. Now we are currently aggregating capital investment developed and jobs announced in 2023, and we're now projecting that we will exceed the $200 billion line with full confidence. We can say that, and we'll also expect when fully realized to develop about over 200,000 new American jobs. So that's a lot of stronger businesses, a lot of stronger families and communities. It's absolutely amazing what you and your networks do, and we can't thank you enough for that. And we know that one of the reasons why we succeed is that we have the best economic developers in the world deploying the best future-focused strategies, including leveraging grant funding and being really aggressive on that end. And that's paid a lot of really important dividends, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So with that said, let me get out of the way. Let's dive in. Welcome to the Leveraging Federal Grant Opportunities to Accelerate Economic Development webcast, led by the great John Zakian and Julie Norman of GrantWorks. So if you're not familiar with GrantWorks just yet, it's a great SCDC partner. They have assisted over 625 state, county, city economic development organizations, helped them secure over $8 billion of assistance to move the needle on project implementation. So Julie is here, Julie Norman. She's the Associate VP of Economic Development. And John, you've seen him at our conferences. I'm glad to have him on the webinar as the Senior VP of Program Development. So before we turn it to them, be thinking of questions throughout the life of this session. They may get to them on a couple of slides, but pop it in the chat. They'll get to it on the back end. Also, when this is over, let's just have a discussion as a family here with our experts and among ourselves. So be thinking of questions, and we'll see you on the back end. So sorry for our delay. John, Julie, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Matthew. We appreciate the opportunity to make this presentation. Hopefully it works. We are using slides, not to put Matthew on the spot, but I'm sure if any of you want a copy of the slides once the webinar is over, it's easy enough to get to you, and either Matthew at SCDC can get it to you, or we certainly can. I do want to echo kudos to SCDC for being one of the leading entities representing economic development professionalism. I'm glad to see all of you as members. We do advance the needle, which is very important. Just very briefly about GrantWorks, in addition to what Matthew graciously explained, GrantWorks is what the name says. Our professional focus is on everything to do with grant administration at the state and federal level. All elements of grant administration and grant application is what our business model is. I am a certified economic developer. Julie also is a certified economic developer. I've been in this business for 40 years. I'll let Julie explain how long, to not get in trouble, I'll let Julie, when it's her turn, explain to you how long she's been in it. And in fact, with that, I'll turn over the next slide to Julie.
Okay, thank you, John. I'm going to go off camera for now, but I'll rejoin once we get through with the presentation. But yes, I too am a certified economic developer. I've been a longtime member of SCDC over the years, about 30 years in economic development at the state, regional, and local levels in both West Virginia and South Carolina. I just joined GrantWorks in September. So let's kick it off. Let's start with talking a little bit about where do we go and what do we do when it comes to being able to apply for a grant. And I've got to somehow move my, here we go. Some of you probably already are familiar with grants.gov, but if you've, especially if you've ever either searched for or applied for a federal grant, but I do think the process is worth covering just in case it's been a while or if we have some folks new to the system. So grants.gov is the repository for all federal funding opportunities that allows applicants to search for grants and apply for grants. And it gives you a really fast and easy way to find those notices of funding opportunity at the federal level. And you can do it in a very simple way, secure way without paper. You no longer have to research dozens of individual agency websites and navigate complex processes because it's all in one place now. And the best feature, in my opinion, is the search capability. You can do a keyword search, such as roads, water, industrial. You can do an advanced search by category, like housing, community development, transportation, workforce. You can search by agency, the eligible applicants. You can search just for the grants available to cities or counties or states, nonprofits. You can also search by the type of funding, whether it's a grant, a loan, and so forth. And if you actually register with grants.gov, you will be able to save your searches and have alerts sent directly to you, to your email, of any future grant opportunities. So when applying on grants.gov, you're going to have lots of fillable forms, downloadable forms, error checks, dedicated customer support, and all the standardized submission capability. You're also going to be able to track your application status in grants.gov after you submit an application. However, there are typically about 1,000 grant opportunities at any one time, totaling over 500 billion annually. So it can be a little daunting. I would say, anyone searching for funding, you can search all you like without registering, but if you intend to apply for a grant, you have to create an account, which requires a SAM.gov registration. SAM is the System for Award Management. So you have to do that in order to establish organizational authority to do business with the federal government. Each user is going to be provided with a 12-digit unique entity identification number, UEI number, in order to be able to apply for a grant through grants.gov. Now that replaces the old DUNS number. If any of you are familiar with that, used to use that. So this is required for government entities, nonprofits, private businesses, even individuals. It is free to register, but it might take 7 to 10 days to complete the registration process. So make sure you plan accordingly. After you get the UEI number from SAM.gov, you go back to grants.gov to continue the registration and establish your account. And you have to use the same email address that you use with SAM.gov, but that person can delegate administrative roles to other users within your organization. Okay. And also SAM registration has to be renewed annually. So if you've done it before, but it may have expired, you need to stay on top of that. Now, the Federal Register is where all the rules and regulations associated with funding opportunities are going to be posted. And when you're reading a description of a funding opportunity or a NOFO, notice of funding opportunity, you're probably going to find some reference or a citation to the Federal Register. I would pay attention to that because that's going to give you granular detail as to what is required, expected, and so forth with regard to this grant. Other places you might want to look for grants are foundations, corporate philanthropies. Think Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Ford Foundation, Kellogg, Mellon, Annie E. Casey, United Way, even the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. There's lots and lots of them. Grantwatch.com is some place you can search for these, but there are over 28,000 grants in their database. And but in order to use keywords and do an advanced search you do have to set up an alert, which requires a paid subscription. And then, of course, there's the federal and state agency websites. Now, typically all your agencies, your federal agencies, are going to list their grant opportunities, and they're going to explain who's eligible to apply. But it's also a really good place to understand the agency's mission and what their investment priorities are, particularly with a certain kind of grant. However, a word of caution here. Sometimes these grant opportunities may not always be currently available. So they might list every program that they administer and the grants related to those programs, but that does not mean that funding is currently available today. So because they may be out of money, even if there is no submission deadline. So it's a good idea to cross-check what you find out on an agency's website with what's on grants.gov, and then also the Federal Register. John, would you like to add anything before moving on?
Yeah, just two quick comments. Thank you, Julia. Julia has offered you kind of a comprehensive first steps. On foundations and corporate philanthropies, what you are going to find, if you haven't already experienced this, is that almost all, not totally, but probably 80 to 85% of federal grants require a local match. It has to be non-federal money. Oftentimes, foundations and corporate philanthropies, if you don't have the local resources at the local level, can be the source of funding. They may not give you the millions of dollars, but they may be able to give you the hundreds of thousands of dollars that are necessary to meet a 10, 15, or 20% match, which is generally the amount of money that's necessary on these federal programs. Go ahead and advance, Julie. One other thing before we get into the key federal laws, it's worth, especially in the last 18 months to 2 years, more and more federal agencies are promoting transparency, and what they're doing is actually on their websites listing grants already awarded. So if you're thinking about going after a future grant, the odds are that the prior at least 2 years of those grants will be listed on the website, which will give you an idea of the types of projects and the amount of funding on average that the federal agency is giving for the particular federal grant you're looking for. Now, in terms of the key federal laws when it comes to federal grants, currently there are 3. I will say that as we sit here today, there has never been in the history of the federal government, believe it or not, more opportunities for federal grants than are available today. And the key federal laws are the Annual Appropriations Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which is referred to as Bill. It's also IIJA, and then the Inflation Reduction Act, which is also referred to as IRA. For any of you that have followed the travails of Congress these days, although technically the federal fiscal year starts October 1st, we currently do not have a budget. And the latest extension approved by Congress takes us to March 8th. Now, what that means is that Congress has assured that no federal agency is going to shut down, but there's no new money. So grant programs on an annual basis that rely on annual appropriations, they currently are not being made available because there are no appropriations. Presuming that there is some agreement on an overall appropriations budget in March, then starting in April is when you can start looking for the notice of funding opportunities to announce the annual grant programs. Now, both the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act were ballyhooed as offering trillions of dollars of funds. And everybody thought that in 2022 and 2023, those trillions of dollars of funds were going to be poured into communities. Well, the fact of the matter is, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law actually spreads out the funding over 5 years, and the Inflation Reduction Act spreads it out over 3 years. So if you've seen a program under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that you're interested in, but you missed the notice of funding opportunity for 22 or 23, not a problem. It will probably also be in 2024, 2025, and 2026. The main emphasis in bill is in infrastructure and broadband. Keep in mind that a lot of economic development projects actually can connect to necessary infrastructure needs. So there may be competitive grants under the bipartisan infrastructure law that could be of value to you, especially through such agencies as the Department of Transportation. The Inflation Reduction Act is a little misleading. Billions of dollars under this act are actually for tax credits, not for grants. But there are multiple new competitive grant programs being funded under the IRA. The IRA is 3 years, and the initial round was 2023. So there will also likely be similar grant opportunities under this law in 2024 and 2025. The primary focus is on the Environmental Protection Agency, but again, there could be projects, economic development oriented, that could utilize EPA level of funding. So again, right now, the key thing is to keep track of what's going on in Washington. As soon as an annual appropriation for fiscal year 2024 is approved by Congress and signed by the president, then there should be a wealth of notice of funding opportunity grant notices coming out in grants.gov. Julie, you can go on. Is this me? This is me.
Yes, go ahead, John.
Okay, sorry. I apologize. We're working off each other, and sometimes I lose track. So the federal agencies with the most grant programs, all of which do have an economic development potential to assist in programs and projects and activities that you're considering. Obviously, the mothership, the primary source is the Department of Commerce, which includes the Economic Development Administration. The two grant programs under EDA that are most beneficial to economic development projects are the Public Works and the Economic Adjustment Assistance grant programs. Now, keep in mind that they are annual programs. They are not part of bill, and they're not part of IRA. They are annual appropriations. So right now, that's a good example of the ongoing federal grant programs that currently are not underway because there is no 24 federal budget. EPA has a number of brownfield related activities. One caution on the EPA, if you have brownfields, those are sites that are contaminated. There is value in pursuing EPA grants to clean them up. However, the EPA, in fairness to them, do not have grants to revitalize or support economic development projects. What you can do is get EPA grants to do brownfield site assessment, brownfield remediation. And once that's done, then you can flip up to the EDA, Economic Development Administration, and go after their grants. Housing and Urban Development, Department of Labor, Department of Agriculture. Let me just mention quickly Department of Agriculture. What a lot of folks don't realize is that it has 6, depending on the year, it has annual appropriations of 6 to 8 programs in economic development and business assistance, and 6 to 8 programs in housing assistance. The limitation relates to population. For most grant programs under the Department of Agriculture, it's 50,000. FEMA can be a resource, especially in mitigation. And again, there could be projects involving economic development that could be related to mitigation. Most of the FEMA programs are under the annual appropriations, not the bipartisan infrastructure law or the Inflation Reduction Act. Treasury includes what's known as the CDFI fund, the Community Development Financial Institution Fund. It provides grants to community-based nonprofit corporations who do lending to small businesses, which can be a core element of all economic development long-term strategies. If you have CDFIs in your community, I would encourage you to partner with them. They put millions of dollars in high leverage, high risk lending and grant assistance to small businesses, and they can become an integral part of your long-term economic development strategy. Just to emphasize that a federal agency may not seem to have grant programs that be applicable to economic development. Don't assume that. Look at what you need and then use grants.gov in the Federal Register to scroll through and see the various grant programs, especially related to infrastructure, because a lot of what appears to be non-economic development related grant programs can in fact support what your projects need. Why don't we move to the next slide, Julie?
Okay. All right. So let's say you've found a grant opportunity for your project, and maybe you think you've got a great project that would be a perfect fit for this particular funding. When you go to write your application, you're gonna explain who you are. Are you a city, a county, an EDO? You're going to explain who you serve, and you'll need to describe why this project is important for them, meaning the people you serve, and explain why this project needs to happen. What is the problem that's going to be addressed? What will happen if it's not addressed? Remember, the focus is not on what your organization needs, but what those you serve need. So you're also going to need to think about how do you know this is a need? You want to use data and statistics to prove this need is real. Pull from your plans, studies that you've had done, government databases to back up your claims. What sort of evidence exists to prove that the community or those you serve actually need or want your help? Do you have letters of demand from businesses or community stakeholders that attest to the impact that this project would have? And who else is addressing this need? Are there alternatives? How are you different? So most grant programs offer an option of either a planning grant or an implementation grant. But even planning grants require that there be some basic need and a purpose connected to your local plans and the agency's investment priorities, whatever agency has the grant. So let's say you have a construction project in mind. Maybe it's water extension or roadway expansion, an industrial building. If a construction project isn't truly shovel ready, maybe you should consider a planning grant. So before beginning the application, you might want to ask yourself some questions. Do you have a project that is 30% project design completed, or an engineer already engaged who could complete 30% of the design in the next 60 days? Federally funded construction grants do require that you have an architect and engineers on the project from the very beginning to ensure that this is feasible. So you might have somebody on staff qualified to fill this role, but if not, you're going to need to put out an RFQ and go through the selection process. And that firm that's selected will be a key member of your team in applying for and executing any construction project. Another question is, do you have site control? Do you own the land? Is there a leasehold agreement? Do you have right-of-ways? These things will need to be documented. And if this is a economic development project in particular, do you have letters of commitment from businesses that say, this project is needed and it's going to allow me to hire or retain employees as a result? So while this is not necessarily a legally binding condition, these letters of support from the beneficiaries are required for economic development projects under EDA. You'll probably want other letters of support too from community members, other stakeholders. And then there's matching funds. So as John mentioned, most grants do require a match, and you're going to need to provide proof that that match is available for your project. Very rarely will a grantor fund 100% of a project, because this is another way that they can ensure that you've got local support by requiring some sort of match. So almost always the match is required to come from non-federal sources, non-federal. And sometimes, not always, it can be in kind, such as materials, services, space, utilities, equipment, even technical assistance that your organization provides or donates, or maybe it's donated by a non-federal third party, but it's got to be specifically for this project. Most often, though, it's a cash match that's required, a direct project expense that you or a non-federal partner provides as a contribution to the project. You want to make sure of the type of entity that's eligible to apply for a specific grant, whether it's county, city governments, nonprofits, states. Sometimes you might see something that looks really good, but when you look a little further, you see that it's only available to states, for example. Be aware of the other requirements of the grant, such as environmental. You may need to include a section of your application that addresses the impact of any construction project, the impact on the local environment and any potential mitigation strategies. Then there's the Davis-Bacon requirements. Contractors and subcontractors have to be paid certain wages and benefits and overtime for that on-site work to their workers on federally funded construction projects. So read the Federal Register for details on that. You want to try to avoid fitting a square peg into a round hole. In other words, you just make sure your project is a good fit for the grant, and pay attention to those minimum thresholds they may require, such as low to moderate income, distressed areas, areas affected by disaster, and so forth. Be able to prove that you meet those eligibility requirements with government data. And of course, make sure that your project is consistent with your own local policies and comprehensive plans and goals and so forth. Now, of course, there's several pros to getting a grant. You can get lots of money. And once you've obtained a grant, you're actually more likely to receive others. It's a good way to build your organization's visibility and credibility, but there are some drawbacks you need to consider. You're going to have to do time-consuming research on the granting agency before writing this grant. And you're going to need a talented person experienced in grant writing, or a firm like GrantWorks to do it for you in order to have the best shot of winning a grant, because competition's fierce. The success rate is very low. The success rate for all federal grants is only about 20%. So, also keep in mind there are strings attached to the money. You can't do just whatever you want with it. As an award recipient, you're going to have to be in compliance with all federal statutory regulation requirements and policies. There's quarterly reports, there's performance outcomes, monitoring, auditing, and closing out the grant. I often say that getting the grant is sometimes the easy part. Believe it or not, administration of the grant requires knowledge and expertise and time, which is why funding agencies actually allow you to build in the cost of grant administration into your budget. And GrantWorks, for example, has been writing and administering grants for cities, counties, and EDOs for over 44 years. And we have dedicated project managers that can attest to these stringent requirements of federal grants. But we handle all the reporting and compliance matters so that you stay in good shape. We want to ensure that you are audit proof, because the last thing you want is to get a grant and then fall short or fail in some regard, because you'd likely get it, never have another chance to get another one. So when writing the application, just a few tips to consider. You want to focus not on your needs, but the needs of those you serve in the community. Make sure they're aligned with the investment priorities that the funding agency has outlined. Look through the eyes of the funding agency. Look at your project through their eyes. How does that look? And remember, federal grants are public investments. They're using our tax dollars. And so we all want to see a good return on investment. And that's certainly what the funding agency is going to be looking at. So after you submit your application, it's going to be scored based on programmatic and financial reviews. But if your application does not meet all of the basic minimum requirements, like eligibility, for example, then it's likely going to be rejected. It will not move on to the review phase. If the funder does turn down your application, don't be discouraged, because there'll be other opportunities, but probably is a good idea to politely ask why you were turned down and what you can do to improve your chances next time. Some of the reasons why grant applications are rejected are that the applicant doesn't meet that eligibility criteria, or it's not aligned with the funder's investment priorities, or the applicant is simply just not grant ready, or the application's missing some vital information. So moving on. So what does the grant application want from you? Well, most federal grant applications require the same basic information, but each agency will have its own terminology and requirements, and the way they like to see things done, the way they like to work. Before you get started, you want to thoroughly read through the Notice of Funding Availability or Funding Opportunity, NOFA or NOFO, for the specific grant you're pursuing. And in most cases, the agency is going to provide a checklist of what's required for submission. I would print out a copy of that, have it available for your own use, be very familiar with everything on it. Now, the planning process it can be lengthy, but it's critical when you consider how important this is for the agency to carry out the government's work and the competition you're likely going to be facing. So while some of the steps can vary widely depending on the type of grant you're applying for, the major components of the process include, developing your ideas, conducting your research, writing the narrative, and completing the application in the grants.gov system. So read through it at least twice, make notes on key tasks that you'll need to complete, and don't assume or guess anything. If any part of the application is not clear to you, or if you just don't understand, ask questions. Most agencies allow an opportunity for Q&A during an open period. Sometimes they'll even have webinars for you to get on and learn how to apply and what they're looking for in particular. And then, of course, there's also the help center within grants.gov. So as you're writing, try to look at your application as someone who will be reviewing it and scoring it. You'll even see in some of these NOFOs the rating list. This is how they're going to rate each application. And oftentimes they'll even say, we're going to give 20% to this and 40% to that. So keep that in mind as you're writing the application. A cardinal rule, though, is don't ever provide more information that's asked for. Yeah, I see this a lot. But no matter how much you'd like to share ancillary, irrelevant information, don't do it. It will only frustrate the reviewers. They're human. They're looking for specific things which have been outlined in that funding opportunity. And while it may seem obvious, but be aware of the space and word count that they've given you, and never go over the limit. For example, they may actually say, submit a 10-page narrative with 12-point Times New Roman font, double spaced with 1-inch margins on letter size 8.5 by 11, paper, although we don't have paper. If your application doesn't meet those requirements, it likely will not be read. Make sure to answer every question and provide specific information as required with data to back it up if you have it. Avoid gratuitous and self-praising language like, our exemplary economic development team, or throw in a quote, for example. That's not necessary. You want to focus on the data, your demographics, verifiable facts, and those grant priorities. You don't want the funder to be left with not being able to figure out what your goal is and what you're proposing to achieve and how you intend to accomplish that goal. And if it's poorly written, it's likely to be unclear and in the objectives, and you just don't want to make it more difficult for the reader than you should, because they're looking for something that's very clear and feasible and meets their investment priorities. Always follow the rule of quality over quantity, because we'd rather not read 30 pages if you can say it all in 5. Make sure your budget matches the project narrative and every expense is accounted for. So if you include equipment in your budget, describe the type of equipment, list the unit price, the quantity of each piece of equipment. Don't just say, chainsaws or computers. You got to spell it out. It's tempting to think that all you need to do is convince them of the merit of your project. But here's a secret. Most of the projects that make it to the review phase are worthy of investment. So instead of focusing on trying to convince them that your project is the best, instead demonstrate that your project is a way for the funding agency to accomplish their mission, because they've made this funding opportunity available because they've been tasked by policymakers to accomplish something, some public good, right? So make sure you understand the funding organization, its investment priorities for this grant, and its mission. So from there, I'll turn it back over to John.
Thank you, Julie. So, by the way, I just want to remind everyone that you can use the chat feature. Someone asked a really good question regarding match, and I'll be glad, or Julie will be glad to answer the questions. By the way, the question, in case you missed it, was, can a letter of credit from a bank be used as match? The answer is it can in certain circumstances. Match is defined as being acceptable, varies from grant to grant to grant. So it's very important that you make sure that you understand what is eligible under match. But a letter of credit from a bank is an option.
And I would just add to that, John, that if you've got a city or county council, you would have to show that they are willing to use that credit. Just because the bank says you can get it doesn't mean your council would allow it to, be sought after.
That is true.
Yeah.
And one other thing I would note Julie gave you an excellent overview in terms of the entire application process. The one thing I would emphasize is that competitive grant means competitive. And as she noted, it's a highly competitive marketplace. If for some reason your application does not get approved, don't be shy about reaching back to the federal agency to which you applied and ask for guidance and assistance and understanding why yours wasn't approved, and ask for suggestions on how you could make your application better. That accomplishes two key advantages for you for the following year if you do plan to reapply. One is it gets their attention, keeps you on their radar screen, and makes them aware to be looking for you next year. And secondly, it can be very helpful in understanding that maybe it was just one or two items you could have been more detailed and more specific about that would have elevated you to a funding option. So it never hurts. There is no negativity in asking questions like that. So I would definitely encourage you, should you not get approved, to do that. Going back to the principle of everything is competitive, one of the things that almost all federal grant require is connectivity to a bigger picture. And in fact, in some instances, like with the EDA, Economic Development Administration, they require you to demonstrate that your grant application has the support of either your regional planning commission, your council of government, whatever regional entity that you're part of. The reason for that is that federal agencies primarily look to see that even if they're local projects, that they do have relevance to the region. The next bullet is a little more promotion for SEDC. It never hurts to be part of state and national professional organizations. Organizations like the Southern Economic Development Council, which I'm sure everyone on this call is aware of, is a great resource for identifying trends. They also are a great resource for general connectivity with federal agencies. So the more active you are, the better informed you are in terms of making sure that your applications are as strong as possible. Also, don't be shy at talking to, if not the elected representatives, directly to their staff. It is of value to make sure that you know who the staff is for your congressman or congresswoman, state representatives, local elected officials. In general, just keep them informed of what you're thinking about, where you're looking, where you're going, what you're planning to do. And when you get to a point of deciding to go after federal grants, let them know. Ask them for guidance or suggestions. You'd be surprised at how much information your elected representatives can get you. Now, again, to reiterate, the key regional plans are the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, a CEDS. If you go after an EDA grant, you're going to hear CEDS all over the place. It is what the EDA requires a regional economic development entity, which is usually either a regional planning commission or a COG, to prepare. It needs to be updated every 3 years. Almost every instance, anything that you might be doing at the local level will be consistent with the CEDS, but you need to make sure of that. Same thing with comprehensive growth plans, regional transportation plans. If you're thinking of doing an infrastructure project that is connected to promoting economic and business development, it never hurts to make sure that that infrastructure project, whatever type it is, especially if it's road connected or transportation connected, is consistent with regional transportation plans. Finally, all state and federal agencies, for the most part, have at least state level, if not local level, offices. For instance, USDA has offices in almost every state in multiple areas of the state. EDA has regional offices, and there are 6 of them. Each regional office has an economic development representative assigned to a specific state. It never hurts to identify who they are and to have conversations with them. Even if you currently do not have a federal grant in mind that you're going to pursue, It is always good to introduce yourself and make them aware of you so that in the future, if you call them back, they're going to realize and recognize who you are. Okay, Julie, we can go on to the next one. In terms of the grant review and scoring process, and this picks up on what Julie was talking to you about in terms of the importance of grant applications. What is not commonly known is that most federal agencies are hiring outside individuals to review and score grant applications. I am an example. I am currently with 6 different federal agencies doing grant reviews. There's probably, I would say, in general, between 500 and 1,000 of us going across multiple federal agencies. The reality is that you have all this federal money that's been poured into all these new federal competitive grant programs, but no money has gone into expanding and increasing federal agency staff. And so the reality is that they have to go to outside experts. That's why it is important that you adhere to the requirements of the application to which you are applying, the grant to which you are applying and submitting an application. These consultants are going to be hammered into their brains that they need to make sure when they do grant reviews that the applications they're reviewing adhere to the guidelines and rules of the application. The other thing to keep in mind, which is why it's important to be as basic and straightforward as you can in what you submit. There is a wide level of experience and knowledge reflected in consultants. I have been on teams where there have been partners on the teams that have very little knowledge of what we're reviewing. There have been others where we all had extensive knowledge. The key, though, is that whether you have extensive knowledge or only a little knowledge, you have a cheat sheet, which is basically an outline of what you need to find in each application. The easier it is for an applicant to find everything a reviewer to find everything in an application, the more likely you're going to advance to the consideration for funding. Along those lines, to reiterate, make sure that your budget is very clear. It is important that you justify every line item in the budget. Although some grant applications will allow it, things such as contingency are not recommended because it's hard to explain and justify contingency. There is a federal law which says that all expenditures must be justifiable, meeting a necessary and reasonable standard. It basically is that you be able to demonstrate that whatever funding you are proposing in your budget has been calculated on a reasonable basis and justifiable cost projection and is necessary to make the project, activity, or program occur. One of the things that trips up a lot of applications is that there's actually a lack of consistency in the narrative. There is nothing wrong with rereading and rewriting a narrative 3 to 4 times and make sure that every section says the same thing with the same objectives and the same goals. From the outset of an application, make sure the purpose of the grant is clear and demonstrate that it meets the eligible uses that is being proposed by the federal agency for the grant program. Remember what I said, a lot of times these applications are being reviewed by outside consultants. They're following a checklist. And one of the first things on the checklist is, does the grant project proposed meet the requirements of what the funding is for? Clearly identify roles and responsibilities for administering a grant. What is another one of the key areas it looks for is to demonstrate the ability and capabilities to make sure that all the funds are spent legally and within the confines of the grant program. If there are going to be a need for contracts or contracting or purchases, you need to make sure that you demonstrate a full understanding of compliance. Now, I will note on a number of these items, and it's a subtle soft sell for companies like GrantWorks. It's okay if you don't have the staff internal to put in the application that for certain things, whether it's procurement, financial administration of the grant, that you're going to engage outside consultants. If you do that, simply outline the type of consultants you're going to pursue and what qualifications you're going to be looking for in those consultants. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, in most cases, federal agencies understand that applicants may not have all the types of expertise necessary for the grant program. The letters of support, resumes, that's another critical area that many applications miss. Make sure that all appendix requirements are met. And spell check or other word type of services don't always end up with the right words. Sometimes spell check will misinterpret the word you're trying to put in. So it is very important that you proofread the application. Another one of the fatal flaws that causes many applications to not be approved is either there are constant errors in typos, which is viewed by reviewers, by the way, as a lackadaisical approach to the proposed grant. And if they're lackadaisical in making the application, how could we expect this entity, if they got the grant, not to be lackadaisical in carrying out the grant? So that's also very important. Julie, I think it's back to you.
Okay, so based on everything we've covered so far, and the time it takes to do proper research and write a compelling grant application, it's never too late or never too soon rather, to start searching. I would get into a routine of regularly checking those sites we mentioned at the top of the hour, grants.gov, Federal Register, maybe even once a week. And don't wait until you have a project ready to roll out, but go ahead and start keeping an active list of what it is you're going to need, and then be patient. Something will come along. I would get to know the history, as John mentioned earlier, the history of when these grant opportunities typically become available, because they're usually pretty consistent. And one tip off to that is any requests for information. When those come out, that's usually a sign that in a few months, we're going to start seeing a notice of funding opportunity. Now, one word about open-ended grant application programs. A lot of times you'll see no deadline, okay? But that doesn't mean that funding's available. We mentioned earlier, sometimes they just simply run out of money. They're run out of their annual appropriation. So as an example, the EDA operates 18 different programs. And all 18 are on the website, but a number of funding opportunities available right now, their website says 6 are open, but we know that that's not actually true. Not all 6 funding opportunities currently have money. So keep that in mind. Take every opportunity you can to learn more. Go to those webinars if they offer them, to learn the specifics about what they're looking for and to get your questions answered. And keep in mind that extensions are typically not granted for grant applications. So pay attention to those posted deadlines and put them on your calendar. Plan way in advance for them. And you probably want to make your internal deadline at least several days or weeks before the actual deadline for submission. And from experience, I can tell you, if you're waiting till the very end to submit, you might run into a jam on grants.gov. Usually on the final day of submission, it gets backlogged and you can't submit. So keep that in mind. I wouldn't risk it. But if you do happen to miss a deadline, it's not the end of the world. There will be other opportunities for sure. So I will let John bring us round to the end of the presentation. John?
Sorry, I had put myself on mute and I was talking to myself. I was entertaining myself. Now I'm back. A lot, we didn't really touch on it, but there are a lot of what known as formula grant programs. There's a lot of federal funds, including in the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, that are going to state agencies. It does not hurt for you to really track those, because in many cases, those formula grants, the state agencies act as pass-through, and that what they will end up doing is actually doing their own competitive grant notices, dispensing those federal funds to local entities. So there is, I would, if you see a notice of funding opportunity for a state-only grant program, I wouldn't ignore it. I would read it through, because it may very well end up being a pass-through. And 6 months later, after the NOFO was put out, you may have an opportunity to go after those grant funds. The other thing to keep in mind is that there are some programs that look like grants, but they're actually loans. This is especially true with the U.S. Department of Agriculture in their housing, community facilities, and business assistance programs. However, it's something to take into account, because we're not talking about traditional bank loan. In the case of most of these loans, we're talking about payback periods of 30 to 40 years and interest rates way below prime, probably in the area of 2 or 3, maybe max 4%. So there may be instances where there are opportunities to get partial grant, partial loan, and it may still end up working out for you. So I wouldn't necessarily discount it. The other area that may not seem to be conducive to what you're doing is disaster recovery funding. But I will tell you that, God forbid you have actually lived through a disaster, or you are in a disaster prone zone. There could be federal programs that are available that could support your projects, especially in the area of mitigation and resilience. For instance, FEMA now has several grant programs that are open for eligibility throughout the country, especially funded through the bipartisan infrastructure law, that support infrastructure measures that improve the likelihood of being able to survive future disasters. And that can be tied into economic development projects. So if is a concluding comment, it is that there is a wealth of resources at the federal level. Never discount the possibility of a federal grant, even though the caption or the summary paragraph doesn't seem like it has value to you. It never hurts to spend 5 to 10 minutes reading the actual full application, because it may very well benefit you. And on that, I guess we'll turn it back to see if there are any questions.
Well, great session, John and Julie. Thanks for diving into so many weeds with us. I know we're a little bit over time here, but if you have any questions, I'm sure our team from GrantWorks would be happy to have a quick discussion. So would love to take any questions.
Well, Matt, we either razzle-dazzled everyone, we overwhelmed everyone, or we bored everybody to death. I'm not sure which of those options. We did throw a lot of information out to all of you. I would encourage you to use SEDC as a resource. And if any questions come up down the road, let Matt know, and Matt can shoot them to us, and we'll be glad to answer them.
Happy to do that. That's how you know you did a great job, when you covered everything that could possibly be covered. So thank you so much to the team at GrantWorks. Thank you to our members for being here as well. This has been recorded. It will live on our website. So please, when it's up, probably tomorrow, Feel free to access that at your convenience, share it with your network as well. The next webinar opportunity that we have will be on the 31st of this month. It'll be about building a successful spec building program. So you're free, that's free to members as well. And check out everything else that we have going on our event webpage on www.sedc.org. So thanks so much, team. Thank you to our members. We will see you soon.